Ghost and Dark types have always been prominent in the competitive scene, but in recent generations they have been outright dominant, recalling top-tier types of generations past, such as Dragon in Gen 4 and 5. Some might even argue, especially for Ghost, that they have gone too far in this regard. The Dark type is one of their most reliable checks, but they have become pretty wild themselves. So we decided to explore how Ghost and Dark have evolved over the years, and what has changed to bring them to their current state. Join us in exploring how Game Freak broke the Ghost and Dark type. But before we start, once again, this video is sponsored by another RPG game with beloved characters from your childhood, Marvel Strike Force. In this game, you'll be able to play as all your favorite characters from the Marvel Universe, both heroes and villains. They even have your favorite alternate universe versions of them, such as Marvel Zombies, the MCU, and the many different Spider-Man. The game is rich in lore, as they have so many different campaigns and storylines, and as a Pokemon player, I particularly enjoyed the different lore character synergies and the metagame surrounding 5v5. For example, I use Kingpin and Hela on the same team because they can both summon minions, which tacks on the damage and also makes it so my opponent has to get through more characters to beat me. Also, have you seen the graphics on this game? It looks amazing, and they even have cinematic attacks. But wait, if you're a new player, you can unlock up to 17 total characters within the first 30 days, including Spider-Man, Deadpool, Thor, Captain America, and more favorites. Not only that, but this is the best time to start playing because this January, there are free character giveaways, Jean Grey and Hercules. You can start unlocking them the minute you download the game. They are only around for a limited time, and if Jean Grey is as broken as she is in every fighting game she appears in, I highly recommend unlocking her. So if you want the best Marvel RPG mobile game and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can use my link in the description or scan my QR code to download the game for free and unlock free characters. Also, you can use this limited time promo code DEC24 to unlock Captain Carter and Heartless Strange for free. And thank you so much to Marvel Strike Force for sponsoring this video. In the beginning, there was Gengar. Gen 1's sole Ghost type was completely bereft of stab, its Ghost typing instead serving to provide it an immunity to the Hyper Beams, Body Slams, and Booms that comprised so much of the tier's scariest offense. Despite a great special stat, it wasn't much of a special attacker. Its strengths lay in the utility of its Hypnosis, which it was the fastest user of, and its high critical hit rate Explosion, which could be used against high-value targets like Chansey and various Psychics. The Ghost type as primary utility continued in Generation 2 with the addition of Mischievous. Yes, the Ghost type Shadow Ball existed, but it would be some time before it was used to an offensive end. After all, in Gen 2, there were no abilities, and Earthquake was thus the harder hitting move against the Levitate lacking Gengar, while being better in general into Rock types and still getting the job done just fine against Mischievous. Ghosts were now tasked with taking on not just normal stab from Snorlax and all manner of booms, but also fighting stab, which found its first viable user in the form of Machamp, having gained Cross Chop. Most notably though, Gen 2 introduced an aspect of play for the Ghost type that would define them beyond everything else throughout Generation 5. Their ability to block Rapid Spin, and in doing so, protect attempted clearing of entry hazards. Given the enormous power of entry hazards and carrying one to victory, Ghosts became, well, not quite necessary, but incredibly common for teams hinging on their strength, and understandably so. It almost didn't matter what the Ghost type was, or what it did, so long as it was indeed a Ghost type. It was practically just a slot dedicated to denying Rapid Spin from going off. Could it be wasteful? Yes, very much so. But as far as waste goes, it was still incredibly productive, because such was the power of hazards. All you needed was to keep them up, and if you had to throw away your Ghost type to get it done, it was worthwhile, because you'd then ride that hazard wave to the win. It wasn't that the Ghosts couldn't do anything beyond hazard protection, it was that players became so hell-bent on tunnel visioning their hazard win that they'd throw the Ghosts into the team builder and into the battle for solely that purpose, and not playing to their strengths. In Gen 2, Gengar was the more offensive spin blocker for more aggressive teams, and Mischievous the more defensive one for dedicated stall teams, with its lower offensive output leading it more in the direction of utility, ranging from Toxic to Perish Song. Gengar could find use on stall teams as well, of course, because even though it was the more aggressive one, though Gengar's ferocious offense wasn't direct damage, it was still utility. Yes, it had the great coverage of Thunderbolt and Ice Punch, but being super effective wasn't necessarily enough to dish out the major pain in the maxed out bulk Gen 2 landscape. Gengar was more about abusing the spikes itself, along with other tactics like Hypnosis, Thief, Dynamic Punch, and of course, it still loved to blow up. In Gen 3, spikes expanded to a maximum of 3 layers, and thus spin blocking became more important than ever, especially once the simulator glitch of substitute blocking rapid spin was fixed. Gengar was the spin blocker, not just because it naturally matched up well against Fortress, but because it was far better than every other ghost type. The tier largely centered around passive damage, and Gengar was one of the best at dishing it out, because it had also gained another move that would become a staple in most Ghosts' moveset over time, Will-O-Wisp. It was an incredibly difficult move to safely switch into, given that fires weren't that common, and the tier's best 2 fires, Charizard and Moltres, were both afraid of Gengar's Thunderbolt. With multi-layered spikes and permanent Sandstorm in the picture, Gengar's Wisp was one of the most oppressive moves in the tier, especially since you couldn't just heal it off easily unless you get stuffed by Gengar's taunt. This was the utility-focused approach of the Ghost type that characterized it before it was broken. Yes, Gengar was more offensively threatening than ever with the new EV system, but it was still a Pokemon without stabs, and its utility was what made it so scary. In addition to Explosion, it now employed Destiny Bond much more commonly, which let it ruin all manner of Pokemon. Nothing quite like having a Calm Mind boosted Jirachi behind a substitute, thinking you have the freest win ever, only for Gengar to Destiny Bond you and take you down with it. Additionally, Shadow Ball's first use in OU would be in Gen 3, but not by Ghosts. It would primarily be Snorlax using the move against Gengar, which now gained Levitate. Occasionally, Swords Dance Baton Pass Celebi would do the same. Furthermore, since Gengar had gained Levitate, it now added Earthquake as another incredibly common move it would switch into, which would become a common trait among many Ghosts in the future. It wielded its fighting immunity far more now as well, with Focus Punch used on many popular Pokemon, not just fighters. Tyranitar was its most popular user in fact, but there were more fighters used as well, most notably Heracross usage, whose alternative Stab Megahorn Gengar also quad resisted. Finally, as always, absorbing booms was risky, but more popular than ever with the addition of Metagross. Generation 4 saw the beginning of the Ghost type shift into the more offensive focus it would become known for, and that has completely defined it in the past several generations. Shadow Ball was now a special attack, and Gengar delighted in wielding it, along with the necessary focus blasts to crush Steel, Dark, and even normal types that would stand in its way, especially with Life Orb pushing it further. Its base 130 special attack finally having its potential realized, Gengar became a dominant threat in its own right, and not just a spin blocker, it wasn't the only potent offensive Ghost type either. In Pokemon Platinum, the Rotom appliances arrived, and they were excellent offensively as well, with solid special attack and another terrific stab in Electric, as well as unique coverage based on their form. Hydro Pump was by far the best and most common, though Overheat also had many uses. Choice Scarf sets were particularly potent revenge killers and late game cleaners, and later in the generation, Choice Specs and Life Orb sets would find themselves potent additions to their repertoire. These Pokemon most notably had to be wary of Tyranitar's pursuit, as did Gengar against Choice Scarf sets. It, alongside Scizor at the height of its popularity, was what decried Shadow Ball as a truly spammable move. Gengar could get away with it because it wasn't choiced and ran Focus Blast, letting it drop almost every Tyranitar variant in one. Rotom Appliance, on the other hand, often was choiced and could not threaten a one-hit KO on Tyranitar, so it could only use Shadow Ball with extreme caution, lest it get itself deleted from the match without having accomplished anything. Shadow Ball was not its go-to stab option for spamming, that was Thunderbolt. Shadow Ball was only to be used when necessary or safe. This was such a major defining feature of Ghost offense, having to play around Tyranitar with such caution that it prevented it from ever getting too comfortable. Even Gengar couldn't spam Shadow Ball as much as it liked, because it had to watch out for the Scarf or Chople Berry of it all. It constantly had to substitute on the switch or throw out blind Focus Blast that would also catch attempted pivots from Steel types like Heatran and Skarmory. The emphasis on pursuit to remove Ghosts also played directly into the hazard game. No Ghost around, and you have an easier rapid spin, so the Ghost user wanting to preserve their hazards had extra reason to be wary of getting trapped. Now, as much as we've emphasized Gen 4 as the shift to a more outright offensive Ghost type, we must also stress the continued presence of Ghost as utility. This was most clear with Rotom A. Yes, it was known for Choice Scarf, but its most prominent sets were bulked out Rest Talkers with Will-O-Wisp, combining bulk with longevity and status so as to best protect entry hazards, which had now expanded past spikes to also include Stealth Rock and sometimes even Toxic Spikes. Giving it such bulk also allowed it to take on offensive threats like Gyarados and Machamp. We must also mention that Gen 4 introduced options to ensure Ghosts could hit on the physical side of things. This would be optimized later, as Shadow Claw and Shadow Punch were decidedly underwhelming, but Shadow Sneak's priority was downright excellent. It was most famously used on Giratina Origin and Ubers, where it was boosted further by its required Grisius Orb, but the move saw plenty of solid use on Spiritomb in UU as well. It wasn't Stab, but on the off chance Gallade was used in OU, Sneak was one of its favorite favorite tools as well, providing super effective priority against faster psychics and ghosts that might switch into close combat. Giratina Origin also effectively utilized its unique signature move, the physical 120 base power Shadow Force, to superb effect. Its 2-turn effect turned to its advantage by forcing the opponent to switch around and thus take more entry hazard damage. Generation 5 was much the same as 4, except Rotom A was no longer a ghost type and was replaced by Jellicent, who had it all: recovery, Will-O-Wisps, taunt, great bulk, and superb resistances. It was ghost utility through and through, and became the de facto spin blocker of the tier, stifling Starmie, Tentacruel, Fortress, and Donphan alike. It was only on hyper offense hazard stacking teams that Gengar was used, for its faster pace and heavier damage output, which was much more in line with their plan of attack. And there it was just as menacing as it had been previously. Here though was where the ghost type as pure anti-rapid spin machine reached its apex, as Gen 5 came to be completely dominated by hazards, and as such, throw away the ghost so that you can keep the spikes interactions became commonplace, especially in matchups where Gengar was tasked with keeping hazards off against the Starmie, whose side shock it stood nary a chance against. Ghost also received Hex in Generation 5, though it wasn't used at all, since it only clocked in at 50 base power, leaving it at 100 on a status opponent. Nice to be sure, but not worth the extra effort over Shadow Ball's greater consistency. Eventually, Excadrill was reintroduced to alleviate Spike's pressures, and even hyper offense teams began using Jellicent as their rapid spin blocker, simply because with Air Balloon or Eject button, Jellicent was actually able to block spin from Excadrill once or twice, unlike Gengar, which simply switched in and got eviscerated. Despite Gengar's notable threat potential, it faded entirely from the metagame. It couldn't protect spikes well enough, and its offensive output, while dangerous, wasn't sufficient against the Chople Berry Tyranitar heavy metagame. But all that was about to change once we talk about the dark types. Dark types were introduced alongside Steel types in Generation 2 to help stuff the psychics that had so dominated the first generation. They were major forces in taking on Exeggutor, whose psychics was otherwise a highly spammable move. They also received Stab on the switch punishing move Pursuit, and this would tie greatly into both keeping various threats in check and the aforementioned dynamic of removing ghosts for the benefit of their rapid spinning teammates. Umbreon was a staple for its walling ability, and even Houndoom saw some occasional appearances, but the most popular effective pursuiter was of course Tyranitar, a role it would continue to appear in through Generation 7. Offensively, Dark didn't have much to write home about. Yes, Tyranitar would sometimes run Crunch, but that was more to support Pursuit, to force the issue against Pokemon like Exeggutor or Gengar trying to win a one-on-one by staying in against weaker pursuits. It didn't pack the kind of power needed for wall breaking, though what it did have was a nice 20% special defense drop rate, which could potentially make things hairy, especially with a follow-up Pursuit. This dynamic was highly present in Generation 3, where Dark type became just about solely synonymous with the newly sand-setting Tyranitar, whose Pursuit also became one of the metagame's most important tools. Indeed, Pursuit Tar was the most directly reliable way of answering Wisp Gengar, since it would actually threaten to remove it from the game. Crunch still wasn't too much of a wall-breaking tool in its own right, though certain mixed sets enjoyed its presence to give Claydol expecting a physical set a nasty surprise, and generally dealing solid damage to other such checks like Swampert, Flygon, and Metagross, as well as of course being able to completely ruin Gengar. Usually though, if Tyranitar was going all out offensive, it wasn't using its dark typing for anything other than switch-in opportunities against the likes of Jirachi and Celebi psychics. Indeed, using them to set up Dragon Dances was useful, but it would be unleashing non-dark attacks afterwards. Generation 4, as with Ghost, saw the beginnings of the path Dark would embark on that has led to where it stands today. First, the physical special split meant that Crunch and Pursuit were now physical moves, meaning that Tyranitar hit much harder with them. It wasn't just pursuing Ghost more easily, but also Starmie, removing it as a spinner, letting its team's own hazards to go unchallenged, while also benefiting from its newfound special defense boost in Sand. Tyranitar's 20% drop rate now applied to defense, not special defense, and this was terrifying, allowing Choice Band Tar to potentially 2-hit KO would-be answers like Hippowdon and Swampert. Additionally, Weavile was terrible in Gen 4, but the physical special change laid the foundation for its later success. Beyond Tyranitar and Weavile, many dangerous dark types and many non-dark types received one of the most dangerous offensive mons in the game, the hard-hitting, usually stab, often super effective priority of Sucker Punch. You didn't have to have Absol or Honchkrow tier attack to wield it effectively, though they certainly were UU terrors. Honch even got banned for their strange strength with the move, and Absol made it even scarier with Swords Dance. You could have the perfectly decent attack stats of Skunk Tank, Houndoom, and the aforementioned Spiritomb, and you'd get great mileage from it, so long as you carefully played around the move's failure should the opponent not attack directly. Toxicroak didn't get stab on it, yet the move synergized with its fighting onslaught beautifully, especially with Swords Dance. Yes, these examples all stem from Yu, as the move was very seldom seen in OU, barring very gimmicky Gengar or Rotom A sets. But this, like the physical special split for Weavile, laid the foundation for crucial offense in future generations. We think of Dark as generally a physical attacking type, but Gen 4 ensured it was hitting hard on the special side as well, with the crunch equivalent power of Dark Pulse, whose 20% effect of choice was Flinch, allowing its users to potentially muscle through slower targets. The move wasn't incredibly popular in OU, barring occasional mixed Tyranitar that enjoys slicing through Rotom A, even when burned or slamming dual screen Azelf lead, that would instinctively reflect in fear of crunch, but its presence was crucial for later. The other stab Darkrai wielded, as its fearsome stab in Ubers, bolstered further by Nasty Plot, as did Houndoom and Yu. It wasn't just that Dark was now a more potent offensive type too. With the physical special split also buffing Shadow Ball, Dark's Ghost resistance was now far more crucial, and it had the potential to make many otherwise excellent psychic liabilities too. This went hand in hand with pursuit strategies. In addition to removing Ghost for Rapid Spin teammates, pursuit targets expanded to include psychic as well, as removing these two types allowed fighting types to become even more dangerous than they already were. One actually had to be careful about being too reliant on a pursuiter to keep Ghosts and psychics in check. Since these Pokemon were offensive, they had the initiative, and they could devise strategies based around luring in and weakening the Dark type with one such Pokemon so as to reap the benefits with another. For instance, in OU, a Specs Latias that lured in and hit Tyranitar with a big Draco Meteor before getting pursued would allow Scarf Rotom to clean up much more easily. In UU, Miss Magius could bait in and Destiny Bond a Pursuit Houndoom, allowing a Specs Alakazam to clean up late game. This potentially precarious balance slipped in Generation 5, where Tyranitar, almost single-handedly tasked with taking on many an individual threat, already straddling the border of brokenness, found itself overwhelmed when the threats teamed up, most famously the Latios Alakazam Uniclus trio. This often tied with Jellicent, entry hazards, and rapid spinning too, as well as attempts to enable newly dangerous fighters like Terrakion, Mienshao, and Keldeo. The defensive utility was so crucial, the ideas of dark types being used offensively were forgotten. The Choice Band Tyranitar that had been so popular earlier in the generation was shoved off to the side, with players wanting to use it but being forced to run Choupple Berry for all the focus misses that were out there. It wasn't that dark type offense was bad, it was incredibly potent. It was just too difficult to build a team with the best source of dark type offense, since that same Pokemon was so sorely needed on defense. Gen 5 also added Hydreigon, a terrifying offensive threat, but it didn't get much mileage out of its stab Dark Pulse, because while the move itself was very good, it also had stringent competition for inclusion in its movesets that included Roost, which were the default. On specs though, it was quite good, and if it wasn't dark pulsing, its dark typing wasn't really useful for it, since it did almost nothing defensively, as it didn't actually check psychics. If anything, it would have preferred being pure dragon, ridding itself of its often preyed upon fighting weakness, just like the ghost types, though all this was about to change. Generation 6 nerfing Steel to no longer resist Ghost and Dark unleashed the first wave of their brokenness. All the concepts built up in the previous generation now exploded through the floodgates, and took the form we recognize them in today. The Steel nerf wasn't the only factor contributing to this though. First, Knockoff was buffed, going from dealing rapid spin tier damage to becoming one of the scariest attacks in the game. From day one, Bisharp became the most terrifying wielder. Not only was it now not going to be slowed down by Ferrothorn or Skarmory any longer, its powerful stab Sucker Punch meant it could no longer be revenge killed by steals like Heatran or Magnezone either. Knockoff, along with Icicle Crash, also launched Weavile to stardom, and of course, every non-dark type with the move was using it as well, from Mega Scizor to Tornadus Therian to Gliscor to Ferrothorn. It also made Adaptability Choice Band Crawdaunt one of the most ludicrously difficult Pokemon in the game to switch into. On the subject of Sucker Punch, no longer being stifled by steals pushed Mega Mawile, which didn't even get stab on it, over the edge. Furthermore, the Steel nerf made Pursuit more effective against a wider range of targets, and thus even more important. You saw things like Choice Band Tyranitar pursuing Heatran, or Scarf Tyranitar pursuing Mega Metagross, the latter of which of course was newly weak to Dark and Ghost, whereas previously it was neutral. Pursuing Dark weak walls like Slowbro to enable fighters like Keldeo was similarly useful, of course. Additionally, Choice Band Tar's Crunch became even more terrifying. Eventually, Mega Tyranitar became popular for this purpose as well. Another boon for the pursuiters was that since the Fog was buffed to now remove hazards, with Bishop Bisharp happily punishing the Fog through Defiant, giving it monstrously strong boosted knockoffs. Rapid Spin was not nearly as essential, and nor was spin blocking. This, along with the increased focus on fairy types and their associated dynamics, meant there was much less pressure on Tyranitar or Weavile for that matter to trap multiple Pokemon on a given team, making it easier for them to focus on that one thing that was really important. Most commonly, they were tasked with removing a Latitvin for the benefit of Keldeo and or Mega Charizard Y. Finally, Dark Pulse was elevated into a spammable move in its own right, whereas previously being resisted by Steel held it back. Sure, it had gained a new resist in Fairy, but this wasn't nearly so ubiquitous that it would still hold it back. Teams tended to stack multiple Steels after all, not Fairies, and every team had at least one Steel. Plus, the Fairies were much more manageable in general, as the non-Clef ones lacked bulk and longevity. Dark Pulse was a popular move on Greninja before it was banned. Yes, it would have gotten stab on the move even if it wasn't a Dark type because of Protean, but it was quite easy to fire off thanks to its neutrality. And it had important super effective stings against the Mew and Slowbros who commonly relied on to stifle X and Y's biggest threats. Then in ORAS, Choice Specs Dark Pulse got Hoopa Unbound sent to the Uber tier for utterly dismantling balance teams, and once it left, Specs Hydreigon popped up in its place to play in much of the same way, with less power but also without the vulnerability to Pursuit, becoming one of OU's most feared wall breakers with how its Dark Pulse wrecked nearly everything besides the Clefable that was merely one flash cannon away from not being able to switch into it anymore. Fighting became a newly valuable defensive type for its ability to take on dark moves. One of the reasons Keldeo was so widely used was not just that it was a major threat, but that it was one of the few decent Bisharp switch-ins. Mega Lopunny was also useful in this regard, while it didn't switch in as comfortably since it lacked an Iron Head resist. Its ability to withstand Sucker Punch was invaluable. Players were so starved for options in this regard that there was a time where even defensive Infernape was being used. On the other side of the spectrum, Dark took on newfound defensive importance against the rise of, that's right, Ghost. Now, the Ghost type had not yet reached its final form respawnability, as after all, it still had to watch out for Pursuit, but it was much better in this regard and much scarier to your average team because the plentiful steals that would previously offer respite against it were no longer options. Ferrothorn and Heatran were no longer effective pivots into Gengar's Life Orb Shadow Ball. The Steel nerf in conjunction with Hex being buffed to 65 base power, meaning it hit a whopping Draco Meteor equivalent 130 against a status target, allowing for new sets that never could have functioned previously. A Gengar set with Substitute Taunt, Will-O-Wisp, and Hex began seeing use. In a world where Steel resists Ghost, a set with Mono Ghost coverage is downright idiotic, but now it worked just fine. This set was also used a few times by Chandelure, though this was more of a niche pick. More notably, later in the generation, the rise of Cofagrigus was assisted in no small part due to its Toxic Spikes and Will-O-Wisp alike, helping it wield Hex as an effective stab. In a way, this nerf was probably seen as necessary in light of the introduction of Aegislash, which would have been unfathomably broken if it was neutral to Dark and Ghost instead of weak to them. So instead, it was just a more fathomable version of insanely broken, since the Steel nerf also meant its own Shadow Balls were more difficult to switch into. It was also easier for Ghosts to focus on being offensive threats, since the defog buff and resultant significant decrease in Rapid Spin meant they were not tasked with hazard protection above all else, allowing them to function as their own Pokemon again, which was perfect timing since they were scarier than ever when they couldn't be checked safely by Steels. Having said that, post Aegislash ban, Ghost did not exactly overwhelm the tier, at least not offensively. Mega Sableye wasn't banned on the very last day of Gen 6 as the current gen, but that was because of its Magic Bounce being one of the most stifling presences in the tier. As a defensive Pokemon, it was solid, but flawed because even though it had recovery, it was slow, had low HP, and wasn't immediately threatening too much. That said, it did have the amazing defensive utility of being one of the few Pokemon capable of walling the terrifying Mega Medicham, with its Ghost typing activating high jump kicks recoil on failure mechanic. And since it had partial Dark typing as well, it was also immune to Mega Medicham's other stab, Zen Headbutt. Mega Sableye didn't function as a Dark type in the anti-Ghost sense though, because its own Ghost typing of course meant it did not resist Ghost. Not that this was all that crucial at this point. Gengar's ferocious Life Orb set was quite threatening, but was held back by its frailty and vulnerability to Pursuit from not just Scarftar, but the newly popular Weavile as well. Base Hoopa was a decent Pokemon whose Shadow Balls were incredibly strong, but its many flaws meant it was a gimmicky Pokemon overall. The most popular Ghost as it stands now, Cofagrigus, was a solid Pokemon, but it was a defensive one, hardly overwhelming offensively. Additionally, Jellicent was used again because spikes were still excellent and Rapid Spin was still viable. Plus, Jellicent was an amazing answer to the Keldeo that had a stranglehold on the meta for so long. However, despite most conditions being set, non-Aegislash Ghosts weren't quite broken yet. There was still something missing, and they lacked the perfect abusers. That is, unless you played Ubers, where Arceus Ghost and Giratina Origin were downright demonic. Ghost did take another step forward in Gen 7 though. Early on, there were so many fairy types running around with the 4 Tapus, Magearna, and the reintroduced Mega Mawile that players didn't want to run Tyranitar, which some players took advantage of by running what would previously be considered some form of heresy. Choice Specs Gengar. Yes, it had lost Levitate, but with the only common dark resist in sight being Greninja, it offered us a preview of where the Ghost type was heading. Specs Shadow Ball being spammed and blasting through all in sight. Then people remembered that Tyranitar was still amazing, and this disappeared. But it had its moments, even on the big stage. More lasting in this regard was the addition of Blacephalon, whose major flaw was that it was completely hapless into Tyranitar, but it was so scary into non-T-Tar squads that it was worth slapping a Specs set on some teams and watching its monstrously powerful Shadow Ball obliterate everything. Of the risks you could take, this one was quite tangible in its reward. There was also Marshadow that got banned from OU almost immediately, so it didn't quite count. Its Spectral Thief, hitting from the physical side, was more suited to Ubers, which also now counted another brutally powerful ghost, Lunala, among its ranks. Dark-type offense also took another major step forward in Gen 7 OU, with the addition of Astra Ninja, which played just the same as Blacephalon or other more modern recognizable forms of ghost-type offense. Astra Ninja's Dark Pulse was one of the most formidable attacks in the tier, not just because of its strength and speed, but because of its flinch rate, meaning even something like a Ferrothorn out of KO range could be overwhelmed. The flinch rate extended to most Pokemon thanks to that amazing speed, and it was particularly dangerous since once Astra Ninja picked up a KO, it transformed and went absolutely berserk. Heck, sometimes Astra Ninja acted as a one-time resist to the Dark Pulse from the opponent's Astra Ninja, or Blacephalon Shadow Ball for that matter. There was plenty of other superb Dark-type offense, and funnily enough, other forms of it were also renowned for acting as tools against Astra Ninja. Choice Band and Mega Tyranitar were generally excellent, and though they had to be wary of Greninja's Water Stab, they punished a Specs-locked Dark Pulse with Pursuit, which stung even through Greninja's Resist, bolstered by the Sand Kicked Up when Tyranitar switched in. Assault Vest Tyranitar, though not really a threat, was also a defensive staple on many a team. Its gargantuan bulk extended to take on hits like Tapu Lele's Moonblast and Mega Alakazam's Focus Blast, and thus switch into even Greninja's Water Stab fairly decently. Beyond Tyranitar, Hydreigon also rose for its ability to resist both Greninja stabs with solid natural bulk, something shared by the fighting dragon Kommo-o, which became popular later in the gen to help take on threats like Ash Greninja, and incidentally, whose bulletproof ability let it take on Blacephalon's Shadow Balls, which Hydreigon also resisted. Hydreigon also excelled as an Ash Greninja answer since it defogged spikes away while staying healthy with Roost, and when it came time to bring the pain, as it might need to when taking on the Heatran, it also checked nicely. It could do so since it was both invested in special attack, even on such a set, and it would boost its Dark Pulse with Dark EMZ into a brutal Black Hole Eclipse. Other popular dominant forms of Dark-type offense weren't even Stab. Kartana's Knockoff was its most spammable move early in the game, while even though Sucker Punch had been knocked down to 70 base power from its original 80, Mega Mawile wielded it to ferocious effect. Indeed, Dark-type offense had far more in effect in Gen 7 OU, but it was about to get hit with one of its nastiest nerfs, which was simultaneously a buff to the Ghost type that would, with further help from several prime new Pokemon, unlock its final form, which we now know today. As alluded to in the Gen 4 section, the idea of Specs Shadow Ball being spammed freely used to be unthinkable. Gen 7 Blacephalon was an exception, and that was only due to its insane power, and it was still considered a significant risk if there was any chance at all your opponent would bring Tyranitar, which wasn't as omnipresent in the post-Perma Sand era, but still was a major part of the metagame. It was a strong spammable move, but it was also one that could get you KO'd in exchange for nothing if you clicked it when facing one of the most popular forces around, and if you weren't going to click it, why bring it at all? However, in Generation 8, Pursuit was removed from the game. Suddenly, the primary reason for not wielding what was otherwise such a spammable concept completely disappeared. Without this option to punish it, Specs Shadow Ball became one of the best moves in the game. Low risk, high reward, usable in pretty much every situation. Whereas previously doing so would have meant instant death, clicking Specs Shadow Ball into a Tyranitar now was barely different from thudding into any resist. The lack of Pursuit also disincentivized Tyranitar usage further. Sure, it was still a great choice bander, but no longer packing the quasi-catch-all nature of its previous level of utility, and this made it even easier to spam Specs Shadow Ball, which became one of the most defining offensive weapons in Gen 8 OU. So what was using Specs Shadow Ball? Well, at first, Gengar and a newly nerfed Aegislash sure enjoyed it, but far and away the best, most popular, and enduring to this day is one of the faces of the metagame as a whole, Dragapult. Dragapult is, of course, not beholden strictly to its spec set, and nearly all its variants revolve around overwhelming the opponent with Ghost Stab antics over time, often with status, combined with the utility and and chip damage of U-turn until it's time for its boosted hex to clean up. However, Specs is certainly the easiest to use and most indicative of how Ghost-type offense looks in this most broken form that we recognize today. You simply spam Specs Shadow Ball into everything. Sure, Dragon Ball's base 100 special attack isn't immediately crushing everything, but it gets a lot of opportunity by virtue of its great typing, amazing speed, that puts it so far ahead of everything else that it can afford a modest nature for maximum power, and the many switch moves in the tier that let it hit the field safely. Do this enough, which isn't difficult, and over time the opponent will crumble. Heck, Specs Dragon Ball can even slot Hex into its move slot to become even scarier in this regard if supported with sufficient status spam. Over time, players began to use Blacephalon, a similarly dangerous beneficiary of this change, and it established itself as a top OU threat. The most extreme version of this, though, was Spectrier, briefly allowed in OU at the beginning of the Crown Tundra. What was particularly jarring about it was that its move pool was so utterly devoid of coverage. Dragapult had Dragon Stab, Fire coverage, and U-turn, whereas Blacephalon had brutally strong Fire Stab. All Spectrier had was Shadow Ball, and yet it didn't matter. It was the best at spamming Shadow Ball, and that's all it would have needed. It was nearly as strong as Blacephalon and functionally nearly as fast as Dragapult, which meant it both outsped and immediately threatened to destroy pretty much the entire tier. Packing dark types didn't mean you were safe. Not only were the dark types used to withstand it were incredibly flawed in their own right, Spectrier would simply outlast them a la Dragapult. Spectrier eventually left the tier, of course, but the specter of Specs Shadow Ball haunts Gen 8 OU to this day. Of course, it's not like there's no recourse. We've already mentioned Choice Band Tyranitar's excellence, but one of the very best Pokemon in OU is Weavile, who happily sports heavy-duty boots to circumvent its long, frustrating Stealth Rock weakness and spams the daylights out of Knockoff, which is no longer stifled by Mega Stones or Z Crystals. The so-called balanced ghost being overwhelming is that Dark-type offense is similarly brutal, sometimes too much. Urshifu, for example, was monstrously overpowered, and its Wicked Blow got it banned. In its wake, Weavile now stands as one of the best tools against Dragapult, the latter of which some players consider problematic. Weavile resists its Specs Shadow Ball just well enough to ward it off temporarily, and when it does so, it threatens some of the most dangerous offense in the tier, making it sufficient at gaining progress. Plus, even when it's too weak to stomach another Shadow Ball, it has priority Ice Shard to ward the irritating Speedy Pult off. Obviously, both Dark and Ghost offense, and it should be noted that former very much still includes Kartana's Knockoff, as crucial as ever, aren't just good for how much they hit neutrally. Their super effective hits into defensively important psychic types like Slowbro, Slowking, and Galarian Slowking are crucial, as well as, well, opposing Ghosts. The fact that these psychics can no longer be pursued and thus enjoy nearly unchecked longevity, as seen by the Regenerator Teleport dynamic that characterizes the tier so strongly, makes Ghost and Dark even more valuable offensively. Of course, one often uses Regenerator Teleport themselves to get their Ghost and Dark offense on the field safely. The Ghost type slam into the highly dangerous Tapu Lele is important too. Also worth mentioning that Dark is such a strong offensive type, Galarian Moltres has become a notable offensive threat, with Nasty Plot boosted Fiery Wrath having a similarly powerful effect at cutting through much of the metagame. Additionally, we must mention the physical Ghost moves. Dragapult itself was quite adept at using Phantom Force, whether on Choice Band or Dragon Dance, and Poltergeist was given as a sort of anti-knockoff, though it was more of a lower tier move. Speaking of, the Ghost type effect even extends to Ubers, where Evoltal is required because its Dark typing, bulk, and recovery are the only thing preventing the entire tier from collapsing in the face of Calyrex Shadow, which is basically Mega Spectrier spamming its Astral Barrage, which is basically Mega Shadow Ball. Wait, Gen 8 was the final form, but what about Gen 9? Well, let's just say both Ghost and Dark have ascended, almost beyond comprehension. Many of Gen 9's power-crept additions have focused on the Dark and Ghost types, unleashing them to what can be argued as complete chaos, an extreme version of the dynamic outlined previously. The one saving grace is defensive terrestrialization, which means that anything can become a Dark type to defend against the Ghost onslaught. Heck, Gengar, a Ghost itself, often Terra Darked in order to win mirrors against other Gengars. The problem is that Terra Dark also makes Dark types stronger. See King Gamut's many heroics, which in conjunction with Supreme Overlord and Swords Dance create the world's scariest Sucker Punch. The other problem is that Ghost types can Terra Ghost to brute force their way past you anyway. Put simply, the more Ghosts the better. Look no further than none other than Specs Dragapult, back to Shadow Ball you into oblivion even more effectively. Of course, anti-Ghost counterplay can struggle against Terra in other ways, like Ghost types changing their type to something else entirely without giving up the benefits of Ghost Stab. It's not just Dragapult either. Another one of the best, most important Pokemon in OU is Goldango, basically a new Aegislash whose Shadow Balls are naturally incredibly strong, making it an amazing choice scarf Nerfer that cleans up late game with ease. Alternatively, it can boost even further with Nasty Plot. In case you want to target its ghost weakness with Dark, it terrestrializes into a fairy or fighting type, the latter also turning its Focus Blast incredibly strong. Of course, it goes further. 3 of the earliest OU bans in the generation also centered around insane ghost type power: Houndstone for Last Respects, Annihilate for Rage Fist, and Fluttermane for Existing. Granted, Last Respects and Rage Fist have some pretty insane designs regardless of their ghost typing, but the fact that they are ghosts really pushes them into bonkers territory. Fluttermane is crazy fast and strong in general, but it's that hyper spammable ghost stab that really drives it over the edge. Let's look at the Ubers tier it wound up in, where Fluttermane is also a threat. You know what got banned almost immediately this generation from Ubers? Caloric's Shadow, because it could terrestrialize and use actual coverage. Bye-bye Eviltal, and thus bye-bye everything else. It's the apotheosis of the Broken Ghost project, getting sent to Mega Rayquaza land. It's not just ghost offense either. Look at the half-dark type Chien Pao, which shredded OU en route to a ban and is a major threat in Ubers as well. Look at several Pokemon currently populating OU, renowned for their vicious dark type power. The previously banned Roaring Moon, the down from Uber's Darkrai, and the Hisuian Samurai, which stacks spikes just as it attacks with Ceaseless Edge, and even has a little crossover episode when it terrestrializes into a ghost type to turn the tables on would-be rapid spins and close combats from Great Tusk. Weavile continues to threaten too. Meowscarada was a major threat earlier in the generation that still has a niche. There's still defense to take these on though. Fighting takes on a more useful defensive niche than ever before to ward off dark types with the offensive defensive beast that is Zamazenta, as well as Iron Valiant, whose dark resist is amplified by its half fairy typing. Additionally, one of the best checks to dark and ghost alike is the massively bulky Ting Lu. Ghosts have great defensive options too, bulky Goldango and Sinistcha as well, which wields either Calm Mind boosted Shadow Balls or status fueled hexes, with both sets reaping the benefits of its incredible grass stab, Matcha Gotcha, that also heals half the damage dealt. Remember, it's as strong as Shadow Ball and has a 20% chance to burn. Speaking of, earlier in the generation, Skeledirge was quite excellent and remains viable. And that's it. The Ghost and Dark dynamic does not completely define the modern competitive landscape, but its warping effect permeates what feels like every corner in one way or another, especially as its options get not just more plentiful, but better. It extends to the lower tiers too. Look at something like Hisuian Typhlosion, whose Infernal Parade is a ghost-type combination of Lava Plume and Hex. 30% burn, double damage against status opponents. Sure, it's a little weaker than Hex, but being able to burn while spamming your Ghost Stab and powering up your own attack is just insane. We're not necessarily saying that the current existence of Ghost and Dark types is problematic. Kingambit would almost surely be a crazy Pokemon no matter what type it is, for instance. However, we found it worth exploring, considering the evolution these types have had and how they have come to dominate the game so thoroughly in recent generations. Let us know what you think. Should Game Freak tone it down, or should they go even further? The latter seems impossible, but you never know. Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. And also check out our previous video on the same subject, how Pokemon save the fighting type. We very much enjoyed making that one. And as always, if you like the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Lord of the Rabbit, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, and Quetzalcoatl Northropi for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.